In this video, we're going to talk about chronic inflammation and how it's different than acute inflammation. Acute inflammation. So in acute inflammation, well, let me just say this. In chronic inflammation, we have acute or active kind of inflammation. We have tissue injury, and we have healing. And tissue injury usually occurs because of uh, our own cells. Our own cells are damaging us, trying to destroy the bacteria, getting to the bacteria, destroying the bacteria, um, the battlefield, if you will, Our own cells are damaging us during this inflammation process. And the process of healing, of repairing the damage, this is kind of all happening at the same time. Same time. So that's kind of an overview of chronic inflammation. In acute inflammation, we had leukocytes were the primary responders to acute inflammation, primarily neutrophils. Neutrophils were the primary leukocyte that were involved in acute inflammation. And in acute inflammation, we had, here's a normal blood vessel, and that goes to a bigger diameter. So we had a lot of vasodilation. We had a lot of vaso changes, vascular changes and we had increased vascular permeability, which means there's more holes. Those are some of the big concepts, the big ideas behind acute inflammation. And we also had edema, exudate. We had a lot of different fluids leaking out into the extracellular matrix too, swelling, those types of things also were involved in the acute inflammation process. In chronic inflammation, it's kind of a little bit different. In chronic inflammation, we have three main processes that happen. At the same time, we have active inflammation, tissue injury, and healing. And kind of to talk about these in more detail, more specifics, we actually have infiltration with mononuclear cells. And what a mononuclear cell is a cell with one nucleus. And remember we talked about kind of a cell here, and then inside the nucleus there's DNA and all that stuff. Well, mononuclear cells are just with one cell, and some of these neutrophils, they have like here's the cell here, and then they have kind of like a few or several nucleuses. They're kind of lobes, if you will. They're kind of multilobular, if you will, one or two or three or four kind of lobes to the nucleus. So that's why they call these mononuclear cells, just because there's one big nucleus here. And the types of mononuclear cells are macrophages, lymphocytes, and plasma cells. And a macrophage is a type of leukocyte. There's a lot of different types of leukocyte, but one of the type of leukocytes is the neutrophil that's responsible for acute inflammation, but another one is called a monocyte. And in the bloodstream, monocytes exist and they float around. They're part of the white blood cell, the leukocyte count in your blood when you get your blood drawn and you see how much leukocytes you have. But when they diapedese out, when they get out of the bloodstream and they get into the tissue or ECM, they change into macrophages. And they're called macrophages, and they differentiate into a macrophage. And the macrophages, they are phagocytes. They can also classified as phagocytes. They're also the cells um, that undergo phagocytosis, which is kind of engulfing a bacteria, and they kind of ingest, if you will, foreign objects into themselves, and then they kind of destroy it once inside. Tissue destruction, and like I said up there, it's largely induced by the products of the inflammatory cells. A lot of it is, these reactive oxygen species, um, you know, uh, a lot of other byproducts of, this battle, and so our cells kind of get destroyed in the process. And undergoing repair involves angiogenesis, which is new vessel proliferation, or just kind of growing new blood flow or blood vessels into the area. That's called angiogenesis, and then fibrosis. And we're going to talk about all those things in detail. So for now, let me just scroll down here. So what are some of the examples of chronic inflammation? So chronic inflammation occurs when you have repeated bouts of a pathogen entering your body, or you have kind of a process that's going to take more than a few days to get rid of. So most viral infections, they are usually kind of undergo chronic inflammation from the get-go, because these viral infections last usually more than a few days. Also, you're going to get autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune. Oh, that's too many bumps on the M there. Autoimmune diseases. You can also get allergies. If you have an allergy to a certain pollen or whatever, and repetitive exposure to that pollen, that will cause some allergies. And another one is exposure to toxic agents. So if we're the common example is silica. If you're exposed to silica over long periods of times, you get a disease called silicosis. Affects your lungs. Also, I'm sure you've heard of atherosclerosis. And what that happens is in your blood vessels you have lipids. If you have too many lipids and it's too much for long periods of times, you can have atherosclerosis. Man, that's a tongue twister. But anyways, you can just kind of have these hardening of these vessel walls, and that will cause your vessels become hard, and that can be a serious problem in the future. So examples of chronic inflammation is just any process or any condition that is not going to take a few days to fix itself. For acute inflammation, and the process kind of just delays, and then your body starts repairing itself. Fibrosis happens, and we'll talk about kind of all these steps in the future. So let's talk about some cells that are involved in chronic inflammation. The main one is the macrophage. And they are located all over the body. So macrophages usually exist. You have the ECM out here, you have a blood vessel here. Macrophages usually exist all over the body, and they act as kind of an alert system. They're just kind of floating around and living out here, and this is kind of where they reside. And if something happens, then they start, this process. They first try to engulf the invading agent or whatever and try to clean it up, and then they start kind of acute inflammation. But if the bacteria is being difficult, or the process is taking longer than just a few days, then they start being the primary cell in charge of kind of cleaning up or taking care of the issue. And they're all over the body, like I said, and in the liver, they're called Kapuffer cells. These are the same macrophage. They're just kind of, depending on where they're at in the body, they're called different things. But um, they come from monocytes inside the blood. But when they're in different areas of the body, they differentiate, and they're called different things. So out in this tissue, they're called macrophages. In the liver, they're called Kapuffer cells. In the spleen and lymph nodes, they're called sinus histiocytes. In the central nervous system, they're called microglial cells. And in the lungs, they're called alveolar macrophages. So they're kind of all over the body, and they are in charge of they're the cell of chronic inflammation, if you will. So if these macrophages that are out in the extracellular matrix here, if they don't take care of the problem, they can get bigger. They get bigger and buffer, if you will, to combat the problems, to have more resources to combat the problems in the extracellular matrix. And these macrophages secrete all of the same kind of factors that the neutrophils did, these leukocytes did in acute inflammation. They have arachidonic, they do chemicals like cytokines. They can create and secrete reactive oxygen species, nitric oxide, all these kind of free radical substances too. So they kind of are the cell in charge of the main cell of chronic inflammation. And we'll see you in the next video. Next video we'll talk about lymphocytes and some other cells involved in chronic inflammation.